several lessons about Aaron as the high priest. Now, we finished 2 Corinthians a couple of weeks ago, and so we've kind of run our study about Aaron the high priest through some Sunday school lessons and then through a couple of Wednesday night lessons now. Numbers chapter 20 is what we're up to, and chapter 20 actually details the last of the significant events about Aaron's life. When you come to chapter 20, we have not gone through the book of Numbers. That wasn't our intention. We didn't really want to go through this book chapter by chapter. We were really looking at the highlights. We were looking at the highlights as they involved Aaron. But by the time you get to chapter 20, Israel has been wandering in the wilderness for some time now. You guys remember that story, right, of Israel having to wander through the wilderness? Why did they have to do that? You remember? The Bible says it because of their unbelief, right? Remember the story from earlier, this same book, the book of Numbers, where the 12 tribes sent spies in to the land. They were at Kadesh Barnea. They sent spies into the land to spy it out. And when they came back, they all came back with a good report about the land. The land is a land flowing with milk and honey. The grapes, they're so big that the cluster of grapes has to be carried away by multiple guys. But they came back with an evil report about whether or not they would be able to win, whether they would find victory. Now, of course, God was going to give them victory, that God had led them to the land of promise. And yet, because of their lack of faith, the 10 spies that came back with an evil report convinced the nation that they would not find victory. And because of that unbelief, God said that an entire generation would fall in the wilderness. Everyone that was over 20 years old would die in that wilderness. We are in chapter 20, and they have now been wandering for a while, okay? They're not at the beginning of the wandering. They're not quite at the end of the wandering, but they've kind of circled around through the majority of the wandering, and they are now back at that same place again. They are back at Kadesh. Notice Numbers chapter 20, verse 1. Then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, into the desert of Zin in the first month, and the people abode in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. So Israel has been wandering in the wilderness for some time now. Many of that generation that were going to fall in the wilderness have. And yet what we're going to find here in chapter 20 is that the new generation is going to fall into the same trouble that the previous generation fell into. Okay. Let's first of all, number one, let's talk about some further complaining. Okay? Further complaining. Numbers chapter 20, verse 2. It says, there was no water for the congregation. And they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. So they've been wandering for a while now in the wilderness. And you can imagine that the wandering in the wilderness was not nearly as much fun as the original journey, right? They leave Egypt. They're on their way to the land of promise. These last few years, though, have just been wandering. They're not going back to Egypt. But they're also not going to go into the land of promise yet. So this last cycle has not been incredibly fun. Now, they come upon a place where there's no water. Now, this very thing had happened before. In the book of Exodus, chapter 17, we are told about an almost identical event. In Exodus chapter 17, verse number 1, Exodus 17, verse 1. Here, I'll read this. It says, all the congregation of children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Zin after their journeys according to the commandment of the Lord and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. So this is something that Israel had faced before. Now, If you remember the story from when Israel came out of Egypt, that first time that they found there was no water, do you guys remember the really big, important event that happened then? If you haven't heard about this story, maybe you've heard about it in the Sunday school, but if you haven't, that is the story of Israel receiving water from the rock. When they come in Exodus chapter 17 and they find that there is no water, that is a story where God tells Moses to smite the rock, right? Moses is supposed to take his rod, strike the rock, and the rock would give water. And that's what happens. Exodus chapter 17, they get water from the rock, and the Lord blesses. Well, they are back now. We're in Numbers chapter 20, and they're back in the same situation, right? No water. But notice what it says here in verse 2 again. It says, "And they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron." And then in verse 3 it says that the people chode with Moses. Now what's interesting about that is that is also the exact same thing that happened in Exodus chapter 17. They came in Exodus 17, no water. They blamed Moses and chided with him, and God supplied them water from the rock. Now, this is a new generation, right? Many have already fallen in the wilderness. They are wandering because of their unbelief. Yet the new generation stumbles upon the exact same scenario, no water. And what do? They do the exact same thing. They do the exact same thing the previous generation did in Exodus 17. It says that they chide with Moses. Notice what they say. Now, verse 3 is about as obnoxious as you can get. Notice this, verse 3. "Would to God that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord." Now, if that doesn't make any sense to you, it shouldn't, because that's about as ignorant a statement as you can make. Now, from our last couple lessons, we remember when a whole bunch of the brethren died before the Lord, right? You remember the lesson from last week, how they rebuke Aaron and Moses, and the plague comes, and then Aaron has to run with his censer and stand between the plague and the living. He stands between the dead and the living. We talked about that last week. And the Bible told us that when that happened in the book of Numbers, chapter 16, that 14,700 people died in that plague. It was terrible. It was a terrible scene. Thank the Lord for Aaron being willing to intercede and stop it at that number. You can imagine how awful it was to see 14,000 people die in that plague. But if that's not awful enough, just listen to what they say the next time something bad happens and they run out of water. Listen to this again. "Would God that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord." They've come to a spot where there's no water, and now they say, you know what? It would have been better if we had just died in that plague. Now, we talked about that. Aaron interceded for them. Aaron prayed for them. Aaron loved them. He ran between the living and the dead, and he spared a countless number of them. And now they're like, well, we're out of water. We're all going to die. We should have just died when the rest of them died. We should have just died in that plague. We should have died. Would to God we had died when all of our brethren died. Isn't that silly? I mean, the plague that fell on them last time because of their rebuke, because of their murmuring, because of their attitude, they're still doing it, right? They're still doing it. That is a terrible response. I mean, you'd have to look at them and you'd have to ask, like, really? You would have rather died in that plague than face the current obstacle, right? And I get it. It's human nature, right? The current obstacle, the current trouble is the worst thing ever, right? Forget all the other things that God has brought them through. This one, this one's it. No, they've actually been in this exact same scenario before. It's not like even this is something new. This is something that they could have learned and seen from their fathers. When their fathers ran out of water, they complained and murmured, and yet despite that, God blessed and gave them water from the rock. But it doesn't seem like they learned from that, because now the next generation runs out of water. They complain against Moses and Aaron. The previous generation said, would to God that we had died in Egypt. Now this generation says, well, I just wish we would have all died when the rest of our brethren did. They're not getting that. They're not getting it. They're making the same mistake over and over. And it's the exact same scenario. They have seen God bless in this exact situation. And yet their faith continues to falter. That's why they're in this mess, isn't it? Their faith, their lack of faith, is why they're wandering in the wilderness to begin with. When they came to Kadesh before and they sent spies in, and the spies come back with an evil report, and Israel doesn't believe that God can lead them to victory, that's why they're wandering in the first place. Yet Israel seems to struggle with faith, just that continual faith. And it's really easy to be critical of that, but you and I struggle with the day-to-day faith all the time, don't we? I mean, we can see a situation, that God has worked in before. We've seen God work on our behalf. We've seen God answer prayer. And yet there's time that our faith falters and we act like situations are hopeless. We act like the current obstacle or the current trial is just the death knell. This is the one. This is, we might as well just give up all hope. And that's really silly to do. It's really easy to see it in Israel just because it's written on paper, right? We can see them making the same mistake over and over again. And yet the guy that's looking back in the mirror does the same thing all the time too. Let's keep reading though. It says here in verse number 4, Numbers 20, verse 4. Why have ye brought up the congregation of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our cattle should die here? Well, we know why Moses is leading them through this wilderness. It was because of their unbelief. They wouldn't be in this wilderness. They would have already been in the land of promise. They were already on the doorstep once. But they chide against Moses. You brought us into this wilderness so that we can die here. No, that wasn't actually the plan ever. We're wandering through the wilderness because of our lack of faith. Look at verse 5. Wherefore have ye made us to come out of Egypt, to bring us into this evil place? It is no place of seed, or of figs, or of vines, or of pomegranates, neither is there any water to drink. They complained to Moses, you've brought us into this place, and this place is not a place for figs or seeds or vines. Well, of course it's not. It's the wilderness. It's not Canaan. It's not the land of promise. That it's not a profound statement that they make here. Of course this is not where we're supposed to be. This is the wandering in the wilderness. This is the wilderness years. But I think it's interesting in verse number 6, after they've made their complaint, and they've obviously blamed Moses and Aaron, and they've sent the accusation their way. It's always nice to have somebody to blame. They're wandering in the wilderness because of the lack of faith of an entire generation. But they're going to key their focus. They're going to put their blame on Aaron and Moses. But notice their response in verse 6. Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they fell upon their faces. Of course they do. That's what they do. That's what good intercessors do. That's what Moses and Aaron have done time and time again, is fall on their faces before God. And the glory of the Lord appeared unto them. Now, let me conclude that first point by, the first 6 verses by saying this. Israel was put in a spot that they should have learned from. Exodus 17, the generation that left Egypt, the same situation. They leave Egypt, They come to Meribah. There is no water. God provides for them from the rock. That generation has started to fall in the wilderness, right? Everybody over 20 is going to. Now the next generation, what happens? No water. What do they do? They have an example that was set before them, and they didn't learn from it. Now we need to, right? That is the challenge. That is an encouragement, hopefully, for us, is that we, if nothing else, when we see the mistakes of others around us, learn from those. Don't make the same mistakes that we've seen others or a previous generation make. Learn from those things, okay? Israel struggled with that, and they're doing the exact same thing. And to you and I, it's silly because we can see it. Like we're just, we can line up Exodus 17 and Numbers 20 side by side. It almost reads like identical. It's two different generations of people, though, and they're doing the same thing. And we got to learn. We've got to learn. We got to learn from our mistakes, of course. But man, if God has put us in a place where we can see and diagnose mistakes that others have made, let's try not to make the same ones. Let's try to learn from those, grow from those. All right. Now, in Exodus chapter 17, there was a rock that Moses smote, and it gave them water. So number 2, let's talk about the rock. Because what you're going to find, let's just read it here. Pick up with verse number 7. Numbers 20, verse 7. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water, and thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock, so thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink. Wouldn't you know it, there's a rock in this passage of Scripture, right? God is going to do the same thing, despite their murmuring, despite their lack of faith, despite all of those things. God is faithful, and He's going to provide them water. And wouldn't you know it, He's going to give them a water from a similar source. He's going to give them water from a rock to drink. Now, it is slightly different this time, though, right? From verse number 8. What was the key difference? Well, from Exodus chapter 17, Moses was told to smite the rock. Remember that story? Smite the rock and water comes out. That's not what Moses is told to do this time, right? Verse number 8, what is Moses told to do? Speak unto the rock. Okay? So it is a little different this time. Exodus 17, strike the rock. Numbers 20, speak to the rock. That's important. Let's read verse 9. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord, as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock. And he said unto them, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? Now, I tried to read it in a way that you would pick up on it, but if you didn't pick up on it, let me say this. Moses' reply is really born out of anger. This is a mean phrase. You are meant to read this as Moses being unhappy and angry. He calls them rebels. God was going to provide them water, right? We learned that in the previous verse. But that does not stop Moses from vocally voicing his disapproval with the people. In verse number 10, he says, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? You know, it's easy to take advantage of people that are patient with us. It's easy to take advantage of people that we know are forgiving. The easiest people to take advantage of are people that you know love you, right? Because they'll forgive you even if you're in the wrong. And sometimes we take advantage of that, right? Sometimes those that are closest to us we're more abusive of. or, we just take more advantage of them because we just assume they'll deal with it. We just assume they'll put up with it. It's dangerous, but I think that's part of our nature that we do that, right? Those that are closest to us, we kind of assume forgiveness. So maybe we say things or do things just assuming that it'll be okay. Now there's a warning here, I think. Even people who are patient with you, sometimes even their patience wears thin. Now nobody loves Israel like Moses does and like Aaron does. They have prayed, they have interceded time and time again. Just back in the previous verses, right? Verse 6, they fell upon their faces. But in this verse, Moses, his patience has basically run out. And you get it expressed in his voice and in the language that he uses. That I'm tired of dealing with you guys like this. He calls them rebels. Must we fetch you water? Like everything is on us, isn't it? Right? And he's mad. And his tone is one of rebuke. You guys have bickered and complained this whole time. Not a one of you has faith. Not a one of you believe. You're nothing but a bunch of rebels. And everything now seems to fall on our shoulders. You want to blame us for everything. And now we got to fetch you water out of this rock. And he's mad. Like he's just spouting off now because he's upset. He's angry. His patience has basically run out, right? If someone loves you and someone is patient with you, try not to abuse that because, sometimes even patient people, their patience wears thin. Sometimes even the best among us, the best, what is it, the quote, the best of men are men at best, and everybody's patience runs out eventually. And Moses, I'll just say, he kind of snapped and he's mad and he's angry and he lets them know it. But not only that, in verse number 11, notice what it says. And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice.
But he was only supposed to speak to it.
That's right. And the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because ye believed me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. In his anger, and listen, you and I would probably feel bad, probably do feel bad for Moses. This guy has been pushed and pushed and pushed time and time again. And now he lashes out in anger. And it costs him, doesn't it? Moses and Aaron get in trouble here. Now there's a few reasons why, right? First of all, they didn't obey. Like Ben said, there's nothing actually that was really, there's no instruction that could be more clear. It doesn't matter how many different ways you try to read verse number 8. God said what? Speak to the rock. Now what does Moses do? He strikes the rock. Now granted, that worked before. It actually works this time too. God does not withhold the water. God does not withhold what Israel needs in this scenario. He still provides for them water. God is merciful. God is gracious. And though Moses and Aaron disobeyed, God provided for them water anyway. But you have to know that Moses and Aaron here, they disobeyed. God told them to speak to the rock, and they smote it. Now, there's another reason that that's a big deal. Now we know the big reason is that it's because they disobeyed. But when we come through Exodus 17, and I think just about every Bible teacher, speaks about the rock. Because you come over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and you know what the Bible says? That rock was Christ. Did you know that teachers, preachers, commentators, people for generations look at the story in Exodus 17 and they see the rock as a type of Christ, right? That rock, when that rock is smitten, it provides that which is needed. It provided life when that rock was smitten. And people have looked at that and taught for generations that that rock was Christ. Just as Christ, when he was smitten, he was able to provide, through the shedding of his blood, he was able to provide that which gave us life. And so people look at that and they use the analogies from the New Testament and they look at the story from Exodus 17. They say the rock is Jesus Christ. Smite the rock and it will provide the life that you need. Christ was smitten. He provided the life that we need. But in Numbers, you come over here, you don't smite the rock again, right? If you smite the rock again, that messes up the picture. Now, Christ was smitten once. Christ died once, right? Christ didn't die again. Christ made one sacrifice for sins forever, and it was sufficient. And smiting the rock pictures that beautifully. But if you come back later and you smite the rock again, and you smite the rock every time you want to, well, then you've messed with the picture. You've actually kind of messed up the type now. And so that's kind of a big deal. This destroys the whole imagery of Christ being the rock smitten for sinners. Moses smiting it again messes with that. Now, I will say this thirdly. So not only did they not obey, not only did they mess up the type, but in pursuing it their own way, that itself displayed a lack of faith. And God tells them that there in verse number 12, because ye believed me not. Now, listen, let's be honest. Thus far, a lot of our problems have been the lack of faith and the disobedience and the bickering and the murmuring of all the children of Israel. Well, now we're in a spot where, guess what? Now Moses and Aaron are going to share in that. They have responded in anger. Okay? I can't say and I can't stress enough in terms what verse 10 is all about. Moses is angry. And in his anger with the people, he smites the rock again. And he did it his own way. He chose, he saw this way work before. And in anger, he lashes out at the rock. And God tells him there in verse number 12, because ye believe me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. Moses and Aaron lost their privilege that they were going to have in leading the children of Israel into the land of promise. There were a select few from the previous generation that were going to get to go in, right? Joshua, Caleb, Moses, maybe Aaron. There's not specific information necessarily about them in the Numbers 13 episode, but their loss of privilege is isolated to this event. This costs Moses and Aaron their opportunity to lead the children of Israel into the land of promise. Faith is something, and obedience is something that we got to work on all the time, right? I mean, it's of all the episodes, of all the things that Moses and Aaron have been through, this almost seems like, really, this is what cost them? Faith and obedience is something that we got to have all the time, right? And there's not a day that goes by that we can start slacking. We can start letting up on that. And this was a big deal, okay? Yes, Numbers 13, the spies and their lack of faith, Israel as a whole, their lack of faith, that's a big deal. They didn't believe God. They didn't trust God. They didn't deserve to go into the land of promise. And the whole generation of those fathers would die in the wilderness. Is this comparable? Well, I don't know if it's comparable. I don't know that. I don't know how to put these things on an even plane. I just know that God told Moses, this is what I want you to do. And Moses didn't do that. He responded in anger. And listen, yes, you and I would justify his anger. You and I would have probably been ticked off at that point too and been just as angry and probably would have voiced our frustration as well. I'm not even saying I don't sympathize with Moses and his emotions and his feelings. But he didn't obey. And you and I have to learn that, right? Despite the emotions of the here and now, despite the present frustrations and anything that we would feel that justifies us to do, we still have to obey God, okay? Lashing out in anger, responding in frustration doesn't seem to fit, okay? And I know this is easier said than done. I'm just going to say it this way. Responding in anger, lashing out in anger is not a good excuse for disobeying. Emotionalism is not a good excuse to disobey, okay? So if something happens to us and we get angry or we get sad or we get humiliated or whatever the range of emotion is, okay? Listen, you can't let your emotions control you to the point of disobeying what God had said in verse 8 so clearly. You and I read verse 8 and there's not really any room for interpretation, right? If God had told Moses, Moses, I'm going to provide water for them from the rock. You would think, well, God did this before when I struck it, so maybe I'll strike it again. That would be one thing, but that's not what happened here. There's no room for interpretation there in verse 8. God said, speak to the rock. And as angry as he was and as frustrated as he was with the people, he acted on that anger and disobeyed God. And Moses lost the privilege of going into the land of promise. If there's any story in the Bible that warns us or would be a help to us thinking about our actions in the midst of our emotions, let this be the one, right? If we're angry, if we're afraid, if we're sad, if we're humiliated, I'm picking real human emotions that are easy for us to drive our response to something, right? There's almost no emotions like fear or anger or sadness or humiliation. Those things easily drive us. Don't let it drive us to disobedience, okay? Try to always obey what God says. That's important. And Moses learned that. He learned it the hard way, but he did learn it. And I hope that we can learn that too. All right, let's hasten to the end here. Verses 14 through 22 are kind of an isolated story there about Edom, so we'll pass over that. It doesn't deal with Aaron. So let's come to verse 23 and let's look at the last passage that does deal with Aaron. In verse 23 it says, The Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the coast of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, for he shall not enter into the land which I have given unto the children of Israel, because ye rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, and bring them up unto Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them upon Eleazar his son, and Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, and shall die there. And Moses did as the Lord commanded, and they went up into Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. And Moses stripped Aaron of his garments, and put them upon Eleazar his son. And Aaron died there in the top of the mount. And Moses and Eleazar came down from the mount. And when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, they mourned for Aaron 30 days, even all the house of Israel. Aaron lived, according to scriptures, to be 123 years old. He died actually the same year that his brother Moses will die, not too long after these events. But the last story here about Aaron's life that deals with his death is you see the transfer of the priesthood going from Aaron to his son, right? Just as we've talked about all along, God rose up Aaron as the high priest of Israel, and only those of his lineage would be priests after him. So Eleazar, his son, Moses takes the garments from Aaron, gives them to Eleazar. Eleazar, right? That's a name we don't hear very much. It's not used too much in the Bible. There's some more stories about him. But he will now be the high priest in Israel. And Aaron has died. And it's interesting what it says there in verse number 29, that they mourned for Aaron 30 days. Now, this is a people that have done nothing but bicker and complain and murmur and whine about this guy since they left Egypt. But I think that once he dies, I think you recognize what he meant to the children of Israel. He was the first person that we would call high priest. And he had interceded for them time and time again. So, and as we've talked about it before, we come to the New Testament and we read about Jesus being our great high priest. We only know what that means because of what the Old Testament says. Because we read about Aaron, we read about priests, who they are and what they do. That's how we learn about the priesthood of Jesus Christ. Aaron was a good high priest. Did he make mistakes? Yes, he made mistakes. He built a golden calf. He and Moses responded in anger here in our passage. And yet what have we also seen? That every time Israel had offended God with their accusations, with their complaint, with their murmuring, because Aaron and Moses are wise enough to see they're bickering against Moses and Aaron, but they're complaining against God. God's the one that led them here. It's, you can complain about Moses and Aaron, but I think they saw and understood that they're complaining against God. And how many times just in this book alone, in the last couple of lessons, have we saw it? They fell on their faces. They fell on their faces. They fell on their faces. Aaron was willing to pray for Israel when Israel wasn't in any condition to be praying for themselves. And he grabbed a censer and he ran and stood in the face of death to stop a plague from hitting any more people. And when he had been challenged and rebuked by his own family, he prayed and he interceded. And he won the mercy of God for his people. So Aaron is a good high priest. And he gives us an imagery of who Jesus Christ was. And how Jesus Christ, as our high priest, made a sacrifice for us. And he interceded for us. In the book of Hebrews chapter 7, the Bible tells us, let's close with that. Hebrews 7, when it's talking about the priests, it says that there were a lot of them. There's going to be a lot of priests after this, right? Eleazar is the next priest. We read about the transfer. And it says in Hebrews 7, verse 23, they truly were many priests, because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death. But this man, and that's talking about Jesus, because he continueth ever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. Israel would often live to see the death of their high priest, and someone have to take his place. You know what we are reassured of in the book of Hebrews? We'll never have to worry about that. Our high priest will never again suffer the hand of death. There will never be another high priest. Did you know that? Aaron was high priest, and Eleazar was high priest, and then his son and his son. Did you know there will never be another? Jesus is our high priest. He's not going to die, and he's not going to change. He is the one that intercedes for us. He is the one that sits at the right hand of the Father as an ever-bearing testimony and witness of the sacrifice that he has made. And it tells us that he is able to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them. What does it mean when the Bible tells us that Christ intercedes for us? Well, now we know a little bit more about that, don't we? Because we know who Aaron is. We know what Aaron did. And through his prayer and through his standing between life and death, shows us what it means to intercede. All right? All right. That's it. I'm out of notes. Let's be dismissed.